The Scottish Government's mission is to treat children like adults and adults like children. Let's look at the latest example.
The Scottish Sentencing Council has published a new guideline to help Scottish courts with the sentencing of young people under 25. This requires courts to consider a young person's maturity during sentencing.
So here the emphasis is on treating adults like children.
Why is this important? Leading research on maturity has identified 3 key stages in brain development. The first 2 stages occur around the ages of 12 and 18. The third and final stage involves emotional maturity. This is where an individual gains more self-control. They also become more able to understand the consequences of their actions. Evidence suggests that some people may not fully develop these features until around the age of 25. Young people who are not fully mature are more vulnerable to negative influences and may take more risks. This can sometimes lead to offending behaviour.
Now when I watched that first, I thought 3 stages of brain development. I thought I bet if you look into it, there'll be some scientists who say there's 2 or 7 or 6, or whatever. There'll be all sorts of different theories with different ages. So I did a quick internet search. Look what came up. Top one said there's 4 stages, second one said there's 5 stages, third one says there are 6 stages. And all those stages would come at different ages, different for different individuals. And the conclusion would have to be, you'd have to assess an individual as an individual case, actually no matter what age they are. So according to this philosophy of sentencing, what are they trying to assess? They're trying to assess a person's ability to exercise self-control and to think through the consequences of their actions. So to use an illustration to help us to think about this, let's think about, say, a 24-year-old maniac driver who loses control of his car at crazy speed in the high street and plows into a bus queue, say. So that's happened. So what do we know about that driver's ability to exercise self-control? Well, they obviously lack it because they did it. Right? How about their ability to weigh the potential consequences of their actions? Obviously not, because they did it. So therefore, because the driver did it, we therefore know that it wasn't really his fault. So on this philosophy, the crime itself is evidence of blamelessness. And the more serious the crime, the stronger the evidence of blamelessness. Now, I'm sure you can see here the obvious degree of circularity.
Trauma and adversity can also affect brain development.
So trauma and adversity must be taken into account. Let me give you a couple of examples of what's classified as an adverse experience according to the Scottish Government. For example, your brother's in prison or your parents separated. So if you can imagine 2 burglars break into the same house at the same time, together they do exactly the same things, they both get sentenced, but one gets a shorter sentence because his parents were divorced. Is that justice?
As a result, young people may be less to blame for their actions than older people, but they are still accountable for the harm caused to any victim.
So someone can be less to blame, but still accountable for the harm? Me no understand. That just makes no sense to me. If someone, say, walk along the street and they have some sort of involuntary spasm and they smack someone in the face and give them a black eye, they could say, well, it wasn't my fault. I'm not to blame for that. But you can't say, okay, it wasn't your fault, but we're still going to punish you or whatever because of the person that you hit. You hurt them. If you're not to blame for the action, how can you be blamed for the consequence of the action? Surely if you're not to be blamed for the action, then a crime hasn't been committed. You can't be blamed for the consequence if you're not blamed for the action. But what we see here, this sort of philosophy is a bit like the philosophy of restorative approaches in school. It's not about morality. It's not about what's right and wrong. Certainly not deontological, to use the technical term. It's consequentialist. It's not, the emphasis isn't on morality. It's just on what was the outcome of the action. Very much consequentialist. So if the maniac driver, if he spun out of control on the high street and missed the bus queue by millimetres and ended up just hitting a wall, then on this understanding, that would be okay. He's only to be held responsible for the consequences, not the action itself. Now, obviously, the Scottish criminal justice system has not got to that sort of extreme, but I'm just pointing out the direction of travel.
The court has to consider the intellectual and emotional maturity of the young person at the time the offence was committed.
I talked earlier how this thinking seems to be circular to an extent, in that the fact that a young person commits a crime indicates that their judgment is poor, that then indicates that they weren't really responsible for the crime. They're not really to blame for the crime that they've committed. But the point they're making here is saying that the young are more rehabilitatable, if that's a word. That might well be the case in general. I still think these things should be assessed case by case, though. There might be an adult who might be very much capable and open to change. There might be a younger person who very much is not. So it should be case by case rather than having these guidelines applying to groups. But rehabilitation isn't the only consideration. It isn't even the primary consideration when it comes to sentencing. The first consideration is desert, justice. Justice needs to be done. Punishment is deserved. Offenders shouldn't get away with it. Now, we've got a bit of a problem here, though, because who needs deterring the most? Let's think about driving. Who needs the threat of punishment to deter them from driving like a maniac? 18-year-olds or 68-year-olds? You know the answer to that question, don't you? It's obviously it is 18-year-olds. There are not many 68-year-olds who need the law to deter them from driving like an absolute maniac. There are plenty of 18-year-olds who do need that. And the idea of deterrence is it gives an input into the decision-making process. So the 18-year-old's thinking, right, shall I drive like a maniac down the high street because it's fun and it'll impress my friends? But then he thinks, maybe I'll get caught, maybe I'll lose my driving license. Maybe I'd end up with a prison sentence even, so maybe I shouldn't do it. So it's the 18-year-old who really needs that deterrence more than the 68-year-old. But the Scottish government takes the opposite view. So they say the group most likely to offend, in other words, young people, in other words, the group most in need of deterrence are the group that should be sentenced most lightly. In other words, should be the group that are deterred the least, which I think is a pretty serious flaw in the plan. Let's just put it that way.
So that when deciding an appropriate sentence, we can help young people to move away from offending behaviour leading to safer communities for everyone.
Okay, reading the actual guidelines that have been issued to judges, it says if a custodial sentence is imposed on a young person, it should be shorter than that which would have been imposed on an older person for the same or a similar offence. Now, I just struggle with that. To me, that is just not fair. That's what's called age discrimination. It is an injustice. And that's what happens when you try and divide society into particular groups and have different rules for different groups instead of dealing with individuals. The justice system has got to deal with individuals, not to apply group criteria to them. So this is a major mistake that's been made here. Unlike many mistakes made by the Scottish government, at the heart of it is their beloved United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, because it covers some things relevant to this. I'll read you one of them. This is actually not relevant to it, so anyway, just listen. No child under 18 shall be subjected to torture or other cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment. Neither capital punishment nor life imprisonment without possibility of release shall be imposed for offences committed by persons below 18 years of age. So that's the sort of thing it says in the text of the convention. Completely irrelevant. Now, there is a section that says the use of custodial sentences for under 18s should be minimised. That's already happening in Scotland. In fact, basically prison sentences for under 21s are in the process of being abolished in Scotland. 10 years ago, there were 700 under 21s in prison. There are now 100. So prison sentences for under 21s, I say, are heading towards being abolished. Now, I think if there's equally effective alternatives to prison, I'm very open to exploring those, so long as those alternatives are equally feared and equally serve as a punishment and a deterrence. If they meet those criteria, if they fulfill those objectives as well as prison, but are more beneficial in other ways, then I'm very much open to those. But with the Scottish Government, what we have for them is a drive to turn everything into a branch of the social work department. Now, I'm quite happy with the social work department being the social work department, but I don't want schools turning into a branch of the social work department, which they've already virtually done. The police, which is well on its way, and certainly not the criminal justice system. Right, there's a couple more videos I've made on this matter, one about retribution and a couple about restorative approaches in schools that are on the same topic. They will appear on the screen any second. Do watch those if you're interested, and thanks for watching.